She didn't just fade from history, she was rebranded. Cleopatra didn't vanish, she was edited. They didn't just erase her face from the walls, family. They rewrote the story and sold you the remix. First, they took Kemet and called it Egypt. Then they took African queens and called them myths. Then they took Cleopatra, a woman who ruled an African throne, spoke African tongues, walked African sand, and somewhere between Rome's propaganda and Europe's paintbrush, she magically became Greek, not African, not Nile-blooded, not daughter of a continent that taught the world how to read the stars, just Greek. You ever notice how every time Africa births something powerful, the world suddenly gets confused about where it came from? They know exactly what they're doing, because if Cleopatra is African, then Africa is not a side character. Africa is the main plot. So they gave you a Cleopatra who looks like their reflection, speaks with their accent, and fits their fantasy. Hollywood backed it. Textbooks whispered it. Museums posed it in marble. And you grew up thinking Africa was the background of her story instead of the ground she stood on. Let's talk about why they needed Cleopatra to be Greek. Let's talk about bloodlines, power, and the fear of a black mother of empires. Let's talk about how history got photoshopped. Because once you understand why they rebranded Cleopatra, you'll understand why they've been trying to rebrand you too. Part 2. Europe didn't just discover Africa. Europe discovered that Africa made Europe look small. So they reached for the eraser, not the school eraser, the empire eraser, the kind that edits memory, rewrites bloodlines, and turns black queens into Mediterranean maybes. Let's lay it bare. In Africa, power was old money, old like Nile floods and desert stars, old like pyramids that were ancient before Europe could spell civilization. In Europe, power was new money, barbarians yesterday, aristocrat today. They were still arguing about forks while Africans were mapping the stars, performing surgery, and building cities that glowed at night. So, when Europe finally stepped into history's spotlight, they had a problem. Africa was already the main character. You can't walk onto a stage owned by someone else and claim you wrote the play unless you do one thing first. You bury the original author. Cleopatra was a problem, not because she was beautiful, not because she was brilliant, but because she was the wrong kind of powerful for the story Europe wanted to tell. She sat on an African throne, spoke like a library with lungs, commanded fleets, played Rome like a violin, and moved empires with her decisions. Now picture that. An African queen in an African kingdom on African land, outsmarting European men who called themselves civilized. If they let that image stand, Europe becomes the side character, the apprentice, the student. So they did what insecure people always do when they stand next to someone who shines too bright. They reached for the dimmer switch. Here's the trick. They couldn't erase Egypt. Too many stones, too many scrolls, too many monuments shouting, "We were here before your history even started." So they went for something more subtle. They didn't erase the queen, they rebranded her. Cleopatra? Oh, she wasn't really African, she was Greek. You hear the move? They didn't move the land, they moved the blood. Egypt stayed in Africa, but Cleopatra got shipped on paper to Europe. Now suddenly the last pharaoh of Kemet becomes a foreign ruler, a Hellenistic import, an outsider on the Nile. Translation: Africa can't claim her. Black girls can't see themselves in her. And Europe gets to say, "See, even your greatest queen was actually one of us." But ask yourself this, if Cleopatra was just some random Greek woman, why the obsession? Why the centuries of portraits, plays, paintings, movies, and myths? Why fight so hard over her skin tone, her nose, her hair, her lineage? because she's not just a woman, she's a symbol. If Cleopatra is African, then Africa didn't just have kingdoms, it had empires that negotiated with Rome as equals. If Cleopatra is African, then Africa wasn't discovered, it was confronted. If Cleopatra is African, then Europe has to admit, we didn't teach the world. We walked into a classroom already in session. Europe versus Africa. Let's draw that split screen. On one side, Europe, fresh out of tribal wars, still dragging itself out of the mud of its own dark ages, writing itself into the center of the story with ink that smells like insecurity. On the other side, Africa, carving gods into stone, aligning temples with the stars, doing math with the universe, trading gold, ivory, knowledge, long before Europe knew what a compass was. So when Europe finally gets the pen, what do? They don't just write their story, they rewrite yours. The deal was simple. Africa gets the pyramids, Europe gets the genius behind them. Africa gets the land, Europe gets the lineage. Africa gets the ruins, Europe gets the glory. That's the scam. Cleopatra was rebranded as Greek for the same reason your history got shrunk to chains and slave ships. Because if they admit what Africa really was, they have to admit what Africa still is. And that's dangerous. A black mother of empires, a black woman who spoke multiple languages, commanded armies, negotiated with Caesar, eye to eye, and died on her own terms. That image doesn't fit in their script where Africa only enters the scene as a victim, a resource, a charity case. So they took her crown and changed the label, not an African queen, a Greek ruler in Africa, not a daughter of the Nile, a Hellenistic monarch. Dress it up in fancy words, but the move is the same. Disconnect the power from the people. Because if you see Cleopatra as African, you start asking questions. If she was that powerful, what else did they hide? If she was that educated, what did they burn in those libraries? If she stood that tall, what does that say about you? And that right there is the fear, not your skin, not your hair, not your rhythm. They fear your memory. Because once you remember who you come from, you stop begging to sit at tables built on your stolen wood. You start building your own again. Cleopatra's rebrand wasn't an accident. It was a strategy, a long game, a quiet war on your reflection. Turn Africa into a place of poverty, turn Europe into the birthplace of genius, and then move any African who shines too bright out of Africa on paper. Suddenly, Jesus gets European features, Egypt gets called Middle Eastern, North Africans get peeled away from blackness. And Cleopatra, she gets a passport that serves Europe's ego, but geography doesn't lie. The Nile doesn't lie, the sun doesn't lie. Africa birthed giants, and Cleopatra was one of them. They rebranded her for the same reason they keep trying to rebrand you, because a black mind that knows its lineage is a revolution waiting to happen. And they've always feared revolutions born from memory. Next, we're going to peel back another layer, how Hollywood, textbooks, and experts turned this rebrand into gospel and sold it to the world like truth. Stay with me. We're not just talking about Cleopatra anymore. We're talking about your reflection in the mirror of history and who's been trying to scratch it out. Part 3. Because understand this, when they rebranded Cleopatra, they weren't doing history. They were doing PR for Europe against Africa. See, Europe needed a facelift. Africa needed a muzzle. So they took Cleopatra, African soil, African sun, African lineage tangled with Nile and desert, and slid her across the map, from Kemet to the Mediterranean, from African queen to European icon. They didn't move her bones, they moved her story. And that's more dangerous than any sword. Europe said, if we can't erase Africa's greatness, we'll just relocate it. So, pyramids, mysterious. Not African genius, just wonders of the world. Nubian gold, ancient treasure. Not black wealth, just artifacts in a museum. Cleopatra, Greek queen of Egypt. Not African royalty, just Hellenistic ruler. You catch the pattern? They don't deny the power, they just change the address. Because if Cleopatra is African, then Africa is not the side character. Africa is the stage, the script, the director, the camera. If Cleopatra is African, then Europe has to admit it learned from a continent it keeps calling backward. So they remix the story. Europe becomes the thinker, Africa the muscle. Europe becomes the mind, Africa the mystery. Europe becomes the genius, Africa the resource. They turned an African dynasty into a Greek family drama, so the West could feel like the main character in a movie Africa financed, filmed, and directed. Let's be clear. No one is saying Cleopatra walked around yelling, I'm black, because race, the way we know it now, is a European invention. But we are saying this. Her throne sat on African soil. Her kingdom was powered by African bodies, African culture, African gods. Her story is braided into the same Nile that carried the blood, sweat, and brilliance of people Europe later called primitive. So when they bleach her, soften her, Europeanize her, they're not just being accurate, they're laundering history. They're cleaning Africa out of the frame like a stain on white marble. Europe versus Africa. Let's lay it plain. Europe sells you. Civilizations began with us. Africa replies, child, you showed up late to a table we built, with plates we carved, eating food we grew. Europe says, we discovered. Africa says, you arrived. Europe says, we enlightened the world. Africa says, you turned off our lights and sold us candles. Europe writes textbooks like Greco-Roman world, center of everything. Africa whispers through stone and sand. We were computing stars when you were still naming them. So when Cleopatra stands in the middle of that argument, they can't let her stand on Africa's side. Too risky, too loud, too undeniable. So they slide her over, stamp her Greek, call it scholarship, and hope you never ask, why is Europe so desperate to claim what grew from African earth? Because if Africa is seen as the root, Europe stops being the tree and becomes just another branch, and branches get cut. Roots don't. So they bury the root, elevate the branch, tell you the shade came from up there, not from what's beneath your feet. That's why Cleopatra got rebranded, not because the past was unclear, but because the future they wanted couldn't afford an Africa that remembered how powerful it used to be. And you're not just watching this from the outside, you're standing in the middle of it. Every time they shift Cleopatra away from Africa, they're practicing, rehearsing, testing how easy it is to shift you away from your own power. First, they moved her. Next, they moved you. From land to plantation, from kingdom to colony, from nation to developing country, from human to resource. Same trick, new targets. And if you don't catch the pattern, you'll keep arguing over Cleopatra's nose while they keep rewriting your whole face. Part 4. Europe got a habit, a slick little hobby, of walking into your house, stealing your mirror, then selling you a fake reflection. They did it to Egypt the way they did it to Jesus. Take the melanin out the story, bleach the bloodline, then tell you, this is history, this is truth, this is civilization. Nah, this is branding, this is marketing, this is theft with a library card. See, Europe ain't just fought with guns, it fought with paintbrushes, textbooks, and Hollywood cameras. They didn't just want your land, they wanted your legends, they wanted your glory, they wanted your firsts. First science, Europe. First philosophy, Europe. First queens, let's make them Greek. First gods, let's make them pale, Africa. Oh, that's just drums and deserts, tribes and troubles, chaos and coups. You feel that? That's the scam, because when Africa walks in as the mother, Europe can't play father. So they flipped the script, turned the daughter into the parent, the student into the teacher, the latecomer into the architect. They needed Cleopatra to be Greek for the same reason they needed Egypt to be Middle East and not North Africa, for the same reason they sliced the map so the Nile don't look like a black highway of genius running straight through the continent. They needed distance between black skin and brilliance, between African soil and sophistication, between your face and your inheritance. So they put Europe in marble, Africa in chains, Europe in museums, Africa in charity ads, Europe as classical, Africa as primitive. Same Earth, same timeline. 2 different movie trailers. They show you Europe in slow motion, golden light, violins playing, white statues glistening like they sweat philosophy. They show you Africa in shaky camera, dusty filter, flies on children. No context, no history, no empire, just before we arrived. You see the trick now? If Cleopatra is African, if Kemet is African, if the Nile is African, then Europe looks late to the party. Then all those discoveries start looking like receipts of robbery. So they rebranded her, not just her skin, but her story, not just her name, but her neighborhood. Ptolemaic dynasty, they whisper, like that erases the sand she walked on, the temples she breathed in, the black soldiers who guarded her throne, the African gods she still had to bow to when the doors were closed and the Greek world wasn't watching. Understand this, Europe doesn't expand by accident. It expands by edit, by cropping you out the frame, then acting like you were never there. They turned African queens into Greek novelties, turned African wisdom into Western thought, turned African monuments into mysteries. How did they build this? They ask, as if black hands weren't enough of an answer. But if you accept the lie, you shrink yourself to fit their story. You start thinking your history starts with chains, not crowns, with colonizers, not creators. That's why Cleopatra had to be Greek, not because the truth said so, but because the empire needed it so, because a Europe that came late had to pretend it was first, because an Africa that was first had to be buried under their civilization. Same trick, new targets. And if you don't catch the pattern, you'll keep arguing over Cleopatra's nose while they keep rewriting your whole face and your mother's face and your children's future. Next time you see that marble Europe, that polished, perfect, classical Europe, ask yourself, what did they erase so this could shine? And then remember, every time they move Africa out the center, they're not just shifting geography, they're stealing gravity. Part 5. Because here's the move they pulled with Cleopatra. They didn't just argue over her shade, they changed her center of gravity. They took a queen who breathed Nile air, who heard temple drums before she heard Greek flutes. And they said, nah, she's basically one of us, a European who just happened to be standing in Africa. See the trick? They didn't drag Cleopatra to Europe, they dragged Europe into Cleopatra. They wrapped her in marble, gave her that cold, polished statue look, trimmed the Africa off her story like you trim the roots off a flower before you put it in a vase and call it decor. They said, Ptolemaic dynasty, Macedonian blood, Hellenistic culture. Fancy words to hide a simple move. Take Africa's crown, stamp a Greek label on it, and act like the soil doesn't matter. Listen, Europe loves Africa's gold, but hates Africa's fingerprints, loves the Nile in their history books, but not the people who bathed in it, loves the spice, fears the source. So Cleopatra becomes the last Greek pharaoh, like Egypt was some overseas campus of Athens, not a black mother civilization they've been studying, copying, and stealing homework from for centuries. They'll say, she spoke Greek, she read Greek, she dressed Greek. Cool. And what language you speaking right now? Does that erase your grandmother's face? Does English make you less your mother's child? A colonizer will stand in your house, put on your clothes, eat your food, then tell the world, this is actually my style. They're just influenced. That's what they did with Cleopatra. They turned her into a bridge to Europe so Europe could claim the river and ignore the source. They made her a Greek exception so they could say, see, the only time Egypt mattered is when it looked like us, spoke like us, read like us. That's not history. That's branding. Because understand this, when Europe wants to look ancient, it reaches for Egypt. When Europe wants to look intelligent, it reaches for Moors and manuscripts. When Europe wants to look holy, it reaches for Jerusalem and Ethiopia. When Europe wants to look rich, it reaches for African gold, African art, African rhythm. But when it writes the story, suddenly it's all Western civilization, and Africa is the influence, never the architect. They made Cleopatra Greek the same way they made Jesus white, the same way they made Egypt Middle Eastern, the same way they made Carthage, just Romans with a tan. Don't get lost in the costume. Power always dresses its theft in a toga, a robe, a crown, then tells you, this is the original. No, the original was brown hands on stone, black minds mapping stars, African tongues naming gods before Greek ever had a word for philosophy. Cleopatra was rebranded so Europe could walk into Africa's museum, stick its name on the exhibits and say, these are now part of our collection. They did it smooth too, not with chains this time, with textbooks, with movies, with museum plaques, with that civilization voiceover that starts every documentary with, in the West. In the West? You mean in the echo, because the drum started here, the script started here, the stone started here, the science started here. Europe is the remix. Africa is the original track. So when they say Cleopatra was really Greek, what they're really saying is, we can't let Africa own a woman this powerful, this educated, this strategic, this royal. They can handle Africa as tribal, Africa as primitive, Africa as savage, but Africa as empire, Africa as mathematics, Africa as philosophy, Africa as queen. That's when the rebranding machine turns on. Suddenly, she's not black, she's Greek. He's not African, he's Arab. They weren't black, they were Mediterranean. Soft words, hard theft. Because once they move Cleopatra out of Africa, they can move your pride out your chest. Once they move your ancestors to the side notes, they can move your children to the sidelines. This is bigger than one queen family. This is about a world where Europe is always the mind, Africa is always the muscle, Europe is the thinker, Africa is the drummer. Europe builds civilization, Africa just dances in the background. That's the lie. Cleopatra is just one of the loudest receipts. And if they had to rebrand her to keep that lie standing, ask yourself, what else did they rename? What else did they relocate? What else did they polish, bleach, and bury? Because once you see how they shifted Cleopatra, you start seeing all the other maps they quietly redrew. And that's where we're going next. Part 6. See, Cleopatra is not just a woman they repainted. She's a door, a decoy, a distraction, because when they slid her from Kemet to Greece, from Nile to Aegean, from African queen to European fantasy, they weren't just playing with one name. They were running the same play on the whole continent. Europe wrote itself into the center of the story like a bad actor who shows up halfway through the movie and suddenly claims, I've been the main character all along. Africa? They dimmed the lights, turned the volume down, cut whole chapters out the script. They said, civilization began in Mesopotamia, while standing in the shadow of pyramids older than their entire timeline. They said, philosophy was born in Greece. While Pythagoras was studying in Kemet, Plato was learning from Nile priests, and the Greeks were calling Egypt the land of the gods. But somehow the teachers became mystics and the students became founders. You see the trick? They took African genius, stamped it Mediterranean, then slowly slid Mediterranean into European, and hoped you wouldn't notice the switch. Cleopatra was one of their favorite props. Look, they said, Egypt wasn't really African. She was basically Greek. So when we talk about Egypt, we're really talking about us. That's the hustle. That's the rebrand. Turn African power into European heritage. Turn black royalty into beige mythology. Turn Nile history into Western classics. Because if Egypt is Africa, if Kemet is black, if the Nile is ours, then Europe has to admit they learned from the same people they tried to bury. And that's uncomfortable. That cracks the mirror. That exposes the costume. So they went to work. They took African saints, painted them porcelain. They took black Madonnas, lightened the halos, softened the noses. They took Nubian pharaohs, called them foreign invaders, like Africans invading Africa was some wild concept. They took Carthage, home of Hannibal, an African general who had Rome shaking, and tried to make him not too black, not too African, just ambiguous. You notice that word? Ambiguous is just, we don't want to admit this power was African. But let's draw the line clear. Europe, for most of its early story, was a cold student sitting in the back of Africa's classroom. No pyramids, no grand stone temples, no 4,000-year-old cities with streetlights of stars and libraries of papyrus. Africa had cities when Europe was still mostly forest. Africa had astronomy when Europe was still guessing at the seasons. Africa was mapping the stars, measuring the earth, performing surgery, building ships, charting the calendar, while Europe was still trying to spell its own name. That's not arrogance, that's record. So what do you do when the people you later enslaved were once the ones who taught you? You rewrite, you rebrand, you remix the past until you look like the architect, and they look like the apprentice. You say Egypt was not really African. Cleopatra was basically European. Kemet was just a cousin of Greece. You push the map north, pull the borders tight, and suddenly Africa is just tribes, jungles, poverty, war. No dynasties, no empires, no libraries, no laboratories, just drums and dust. That's the lie. Because once Cleopatra is Greek, then Egypt is Mediterranean, then Kemet is Near East, then Africa is just everything left over below the Sahara. You see the pattern? They didn't just move Cleopatra, they moved the whole damn continent out of its own story. Europe became the thinker, Africa became the muscle, Europe the mind, Africa the body, Europe writes the books, Africa swings the machete, Europe discovers, Africa appears. That's the script they sold. And Cleopatra's rebrand was one of the opening scenes. But here's the thing about truth. You can bury it, but you can't erase its roots. The Nile still flows through Africa. The pyramids still rise from African soil. The temples still point to African skies. The mummies still carry African DNA. And no amount of marble statues, no army of whitewashed paintings, no Hollywood casting can move that land 1 inch closer to Europe. So when they tell you Cleopatra was Greek, listen for what they're not saying. They're not just talking about her. They're talking about you, about your ancestors, about your inheritance. They're saying anything magnificent, anything advanced, anything royal, let's shift it away from Africa. Let's file it under us. But once you see that move, once you catch that hand, you start asking, if they rebranded Cleopatra, what did they do to Timbuktu, to Great Zimbabwe, to Kush, Aksum, Benin, Mali, Songhai? How many more crowns did they hide in footnotes? How many more black faces did they fade into shadows? And that, family, is where we're headed next. Past Cleopatra, past the Nile, deep into the parts of Africa they tried to keep you from recognizing as your own reflection. Part 7. Because once you understand Cleopatra, you understand the whole hustle. See, Europe didn't just rewrite history. They rebranded it like a crooked marketing team with a stolen product. Africa birthed the blueprint. Europe slapped on a new label and sold it back to the world, like we were tourists in our own story. Let's talk Cleopatra, not the Halloween costume, not the Hollywood fantasy with pale skin and blue eyes, staring over a desert that never knew her face. I'm talking about a queen standing on African soil, ruling an African kingdom on an African river older than every European empire that ever tried to claim her. But somewhere along the line, they took that African backdrop, that black cradle of civilization, and tried to make her a guest star in her own house. They said Cleopatra was Greek, not Greek speaking, not Greek influenced, not Greek connected, just Greek, full stop. No blush, no shame, like Egypt wasn't in Africa, like the Nile didn't run through black hands before a Greek ship ever touched that shore. See the trick? They didn't just argue blood, they erased geography, Europe. They draw borders like lies, cut maps like cake, rename everything they touch and call it civilization. Africa, we are the land before the lines, we are kingdoms before the compass, we are stories older than their alphabets. But when Europe arrived, they came with 3 weapons, the cross, the gun, and the pen. And that pen was deadly. They used it to rewrite her. Cleopatra? Oh, she's one of us. They couldn't stand the idea of Africa having a queen with power, with strategy, with seduction and science braided into one mind. So they said, let's move her closer to us. Let's bleach the bloodline, let's center the Greek, blur the African, and call that history. Because Europe knows marketing. They know if the world sees a powerful queen in Africa, black, regal, commanding armies and empires, then the narrative falls apart. The lie of Africa was backwards until we arrived crumbles. So they play contrast. Europe. They show castles, crowns, cathedrals, suits of armor, opera houses, philosophers in marble. Africa, they show huts, flies, poverty, war, safari shots, and slow, sad music. But here's the real split screen. Europe was in the Dark Ages, choking on plagues, burning women as witches, forgetting the science their own ancestors once knew. Africa was building a library so large, the shelves looked like forests. We were mapping the stars, studying the body, charting the Nile, writing on stone while they were still scratching on bark. So when Cleopatra shows up as a symbol of intellect, seduction, and statecraft, they say, she can't be from that Africa, not the Africa we sold you on. Let's adjust the picture. And that's what they did. They zoomed in on Ptolemaic. They zoomed out on African. They turned a queen of Kemet into a side note of Greece. But listen close. If Cleopatra was just Greek, why does her story breathe African politics? Why does her throne sit on African soil? Why does her power rise and fall with African kingdoms, African priests, African gods? You don't become Queen of Egypt by accident. You don't rule that land without bowing to the river, the people, the memory that came before you. You can't erase the Nile by changing her passport. That's the game, family. They can't move the pyramids, so they move the narrative. They can't bury the Nile, so they bury the names. They can't erase our genius, so they rename it and call it theirs. Europe versus Africa has never just been land versus land. It's image versus truth. Europe sells the image. White marble, golden halos, portraits in oil, Latin on the walls, Greek on the tongue. Africa holds the truth. Black stone, brown hands, ink on papyrus, hieroglyphs telling stories they still can't fully decode. So when they say Cleopatra was Greek, hear what they're really saying. We are afraid of what it means if the world remembers Africa as the mother of queens, of science, of strategy, of beauty, that doesn't ask for European permission. They're not just debating ancestry, they're protecting a brand. Because If Cleopatra is understood as an African ruler on African land and an African lineage of power and knowledge, then the whole European myth of we brought light to darkness starts looking like what it always was, a sales pitch for a stolen house. And that, right there, is why they rebranded her. Not because the evidence is clean, but because the image is useful. They know symbols move people more than footnotes. So they took one of our symbols, wrapped her in their colors, and played her back to us like we should be grateful to see her at all. But we're not begging for reflections anymore. We're breaking the mirror. Because once you see how they did Cleopatra, you start asking, who else did they repaint? Which pharaohs got blurred? Which prophets got relocated? Which black saints got dusted off the frescoes? How many more crowns are sitting in European museums tagged with the wrong names under the wrong flags, smiling behind glass, like prisoners? Stay with me. We're about to walk past Cleopatra down the Nile of stolen stories into the archives where Europe hid Africa's own reflection and start pulling our faces out of their shadows one by one. Part 8. Because when Europe met Cleopatra, they didn't see a queen. They saw a problem for their story, a crack in their mirror. How are you going to call Africa dark when the brightest mind in your history books is sitting on a Nile throne, speaking 9 languages, bargaining with empires, and writing her own script? You can't. So you edit, you blur, you bleach. They didn't just redraw Cleopatra, they rebranded her, like a stolen product with a new label slapped on the box. Greek, not African. Ptolemaic, not Nile-born. Westernized, not womb of civilization. See how that works? Europe said, if we can't erase her, we'll adopt her. If we can't bury the crown, we'll move the crown to our side of the family. So they reached back through time, through dust and dynasty, grabbed Cleopatra by the bloodline, and dragged her across the Mediterranean on paper. On the walls, she's brown. In the coins, she's brown. In the oldest stories, she moves like the river she ruled, African, rooted, Nile-fed. But open the schoolbook in London, Paris, Rome. Suddenly she's pale, softened, almost European, like she just stepped out of a marble statue instead of a sun that never clocks out. Ask them why. They'll start talking circles, Ptolemaic dynasty, Macedonian descent, Hellenistic influence. All that fancy talk just to dodge one simple truth. Africa birthed a queen so powerful, so magnetic, that Europe had to claim her to feel better about itself. Because if Cleopatra is African, then Africa is not a backdrop. It's the stage, the script, the director's chair. If Cleopatra is African, then the center of the ancient world was not some cold marble senate in Rome, but a hot-blooded library in Alexandria, where black and brown minds were mapping the stars while Europe was still learning how to spell its own name. So they rewrote it. They turned the last pharaoh of an African empire into the tragic Greek lover of Roman men. You catch that flip? From sovereign to side character, from strategist to seductress, from head of state to head on a pillow. They love her as a romance, not as a ruler. They teach her as a love story, not a land story, because if they admit she was an African ruler fighting to keep Rome's claws off her people, off her waters, off her gold, then suddenly Europe ain't the hero no more. Rome looks less like civilization, more like a colonizer prototype, and Europe can't have that. So they built a Cleopatra who fits in their museums, a Cleopatra who looks good next to Caesar and Antony, like she was born to orbit their greatness, instead of making them step their game up just to stand next to her. They painted her softer, made her features thinner, turned the desert sun into studio lighting. Then they told you, this is history, this is fact. But look close. Look at the nose they filed down on every statue. Look at the skin tone they lighten in every film. Look at how the camera loves her body, but never her borders, never her policies, never her war rooms. That's not an accident. That's a cover-up. Because once you say African woman, African throne, African science, African statecraft, you got to admit that the same continent they call third world today was running first-class empires before Europe learned to bathe regularly. And that truth is dangerous. So they grabbed Cleopatra, flipped her passport, and stamped her Greek like a forged document. Not because the blood was pure. They don't even know that. They just needed distance. They needed her brilliance to feel less African. That's the trick. When Africa shines too bright, Europe puts sunglasses on the story, calls it Mediterranean, calls it Middle East, calls it anything but what it is, African. Cleopatra was rebranded the same way they rebrand our diamonds, our music, our ideas, strip the source, sell the product, hide the receipt. But receipts exist in the art, in the language, in the way Egypt sits on that African plate, no matter how hard they tug it toward Europe on the map in your classroom. They can rename the queen, they can rename the river, they can rename the land, but the soil knows, the sun knows, the blood remembers, and so do we. Once we start looking with our own eyes instead of theirs, stay seated. Next, we're walking into the casting room where Hollywood took Cleopatra, ran her through the beauty filter, and turned a Nile queen into a European fantasy. And we're going to strip that image down to the bones and rebuild her in her own light. Part 9. Lights down, projector on. You know this room. You've been sitting in it your whole life. Posters on the wall, Elizabeth Taylor with the eyeliner, white skin glowing like a lighthouse in the desert. Blue eyes where brown should be. Romeo accents on African soil. They told you, this is Cleopatra. And you believed it, because who controls the camera controls the memory. See, Europe got a habit. They don't just take land, they take faces. They don't just steal gold, they steal stories, polish them, powder them, and send them back to you with your name scratched off and theirs stamped on top. That's what they did with Cleopatra. They knew her throne sat in Africa on Nile water, under African sun, but they needed her to look like them so they could feel like they owned the whole script. So they reached back through time, grabbed a queen from the river, dragged her through European paint, and said, from now on, she's ours. Understand this. Greece was the costume. Africa was the body, but Europe fell in love with the costume. They wrapped her in marble statues, Roman gossip, Greek footnotes, and called it truth. They said she was Greek, so she was like us, civilized, refined, almost European. Translation, if we can make your queen look like our cousin, then your greatness becomes our reflection. That's the trick. Because if Cleopatra is African, sitting on African stone, speaking African tongues, moving with African gods whispering in her ear, then suddenly Africa ain't just drums and dust like they sold you. Suddenly Africa is mathematics, medicine, naval fleets, libraries, and a queen that Rome had to negotiate with instead of just invade. That image is dangerous to a Europe built on the idea that Africa was backward until they discovered it. So what do you do with a dangerous image? You blur it, you bleach it, you rebrand it. You say, her dynasty was Macedonian, so she's Greek, and you stop the sentence there. You don't mention that dynasties mix, that blood travels, that Africa don't ask your passport before it blesses your DNA. You don't mention that Cleopatra's world was not white marble and snow, but dark soil and hot wind, copper skin and temple shadows, incense thick as history. No, you freeze her in stone, give her a sharp nose, thin lips, and a British accent, and call that accuracy. Hollywood stepped in like a priest of the new church, projector as pulpit, casting call as scripture. They didn't just pick an actress, they picked a side. They chose Europe over Africa. They chose pale over sun-kissed. They chose empire over Nile. And every time you saw that poster, that movie, That Halloween costume with the gold headband and the wrong face. They were whispering to you, Africans were never that powerful. Not really, not like this. But here's the crack in their story. If Cleopatra was only Greek, why they so pressed to prove it? Why the anger when anyone says African? Why the panic when the Nile is mentioned before Macedonia? Because deep down, they know if you accept that an African throne could birth a woman who spoke many languages, played Rome like a chessboard, commanded fleets, and loved on her own terms, then the whole civilized versus savage fairy tale starts falling apart. And if that falls apart, a lot of other lies start shaking too. So they hold the line, they guard that casting choice like a border, Europe on the screen and Africa in the shadows. But we're not in the shadows anymore. We are in the casting room, turning the lights up, looking Hollywood dead in the eye, saying, yes, run that back from the top. This time, we're not erasing Africa to make you feel tall, because Cleopatra wasn't some lost Greek tourist who took a wrong turn at the Aegean and stumbled into Egypt. She was shaped by African soil, African gods, African politics, African storms. You can't separate a queen from the land that crowned her just because you like how her name sounds in your accent. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to strip off the European filter, wipe away the studio makeup, put down the marble busts and the British narrators, and walk her back across the Mediterranean, past the Roman fan fiction, past the Greek footnotes, back to the river that knew her real reflection. Stay with me. Next, we're stepping out of this casting room and into Kemet itself, into the temples, the tombs, the ink, the stone, to see what the Africans who lived with her, prayed near her, fought beside her, actually left behind. Because once Africa starts speaking for itself, Europe's version starts to sound real thin. Part 10. Now watch this. When you stop letting Europe do the voiceover, and you let Africa read its own script, the whole movie changes. Step into Kemet, not the museum remix, the real thing. Sun on stone, dust in your lungs, Nile breathing slow. Look at the walls, not the captions. The walls, brown skin, coal-lined eyes, full lips, broad noses, tight curls carved in stone before race science ever tried to measure a skull. These weren't extras. These were gods, queens, soldiers, scribes. The people who named the stars before Europe even knew how to spell civilization. Now here comes the trick. Europe walks in late, centuries after the credits rolled, looks up at African faces painted in deep brown and gold and says, ah, yes, clearly Greek. You see the game? In Africa, they carved what they saw. In Europe, they painted what they needed. Africa said, these are our kings, our queens, our blood, our neighbors, our rulers. Europe said, these are our ancestors now. Let's adjust the lighting. So they dim the melanin, brighten the marble, and call it accuracy. But walk with me back into those temples. You don't see a whitewashed world. You see Nubians, Kushites, Kemets, Libyans, all in the same script. Sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, always African. Even when foreigners show up, Africa doesn't forget itself. The scribes don't suddenly start drawing blonde hair and pink skin just because someone sailed in from the north. They knew the difference between a neighbor and a stranger. And here's the thing. If Cleopatra walked these halls and looked nothing like them, those same scribes would have carved that too. They were petty with detail. They didn't miss. But that's not what we see. We see a long line of African queens, African gods, African rulers, stretching back thousands of years, and Europe trying to park its reflection right in the middle of it like it belongs there. In the temples, Africa is center stage. In the textbooks, Africa is a background extra with no speaking lines. In Kemet, the Nile is the spine of the story. In Europe's version, the Nile is just a set piece for a Greek tragedy. Over here, Cleopatra is the last breath of an African empire that refused to bow. Over there, she's a side character in Rome's soap opera, a pretty face to motivate a white man's downfall. That's not history, that's marketing. Because if Cleopatra stands as African, fully, loudly, undeniably, then Europe has to admit that the last great rival it had to bury wasn't the East, it was Africa. So what do you do if you are building a world where Europe is the main character? You don't just erase people. You repaint them, you recast them, you rename them. Kemet becomes Egypt. Africans become others. Black rulers become exceptions. And Cleopatra, she gets rebranded like a stolen product with the label peeled off. Not because the stone said so, not because the ink said so, but because Europe couldn't stand the image of a black woman standing eye to eye with Rome, calling her own shots, controlling her own borders, commanding her own navy, and making emperors lose sleep. So Europe wrote a new script, gave her a new face, called it civilized. But stone doesn't lie. Ink doesn't flinch. Temples don't rewrite themselves to match a conqueror's fantasy. The lie lives in the retelling, not in the ruins. And that's why we're here, not to beg for inclusion in somebody else's story, but to let Africa's receipts speak louder than Europe's revisions. Because once you've heard what the walls are really saying, you'll never look at a white Cleopatra poster the same way again. Now, let's walk deeper, past the tourist ropes, past the guide's soft voice into the tombs and texts that survived empire, invasion, and deliberate forgetting. Let's see what happens when Cleopatra steps off Europe's stage and stands back in Africa's light. Part 11. In Africa's light, Cleopatra don't walk out like some side character in a Roman love story. She steps out like a storm, like a verdict, like the last daughter of a 3,000-year-old civilization that refused to bow to anybody's flag. But Europe met that light, squinted its eyes, and reached for its paintbrush. Because here's the thing, you can't steal a house and leave the name on the mailbox. You got to repaint it, rename it, rewrite who lived there and what they looked like. So they took Cleopatra, the African queen standing on African soil, ruling African people, speaking African tongues, praying to African gods, and slowly, layer by layer, they dressed her in Europe. Not with facts, with fantasy. They said, let's make her Greek fully, completely, only. Nothing African to see here, folks. They grabbed one thread of truth. Yes, the dynasty was Macedonian, then spun it like cotton candy around a rotten core of lies. Because power loves half-truths. Half-truths travel further than full lies. They sound educated, they sound neutral, they sound safe. Ptolemaic, therefore Greek. Greek, therefore European. European, therefore ours. You see the trick? They snatched her from the Nile and sat her on the Aegean. They pulled her from the desert sun and tucked her under a cloudy sky. They took her from Cush and Kemet's neighborhood and moved her into Plato's apartment. They knew what they were doing. If Cleopatra is African, then Africa is not just tribes and jungles and waiting for civilization to arrive. If Cleopatra is African, then Africa is science, statecraft, naval fleets, diplomacy, libraries, medicine, mathematics, gold and grain and gods. If Cleopatra is African, then Europe has to look Africa in the eye and say, we learned from you. And history class in London, Paris, Rome. They were not ready for that confession, so they rebranded the queen. They sliced her story away from her soil. They said, forget the black and brown faces she ruled over. Forget the Nubian generals. Forget the African priests, the African soldiers, the African artisans carving her into temple walls. They zoomed in on her bloodline like a man looking for a loophole. Look, look, look. Her ancestors came with Alexander, so she's ours. She's basically European. As if blood alone decides your world, as if culture, land, language, the gods you call at midnight, the sun you wake up under don't shape a person's soul. Let's talk about Europe versus Africa. Europe sells you Cleopatra as a pale, tragic lover lying on a Roman couch, wrapped in silk, whispering to Caesar, crying over Antony. Africa remembers Cleopatra as a strategist, counting ships, balancing Rome against Parthia, playing chess on a world map, while men played checkers with their pride. Europe wants you to see her bedroom. Africa wants you to see her war room. Europe zooms in on who she kissed. Africa zooms in on what she commanded. Europe, was she beautiful? Was she seductive? Was she exotic? Africa, was she effective? Did she hold the line? Did she keep the invaders out just one more generation? Because in Africa, queens weren't just pretty ornaments. They were borders with a heartbeat. And that's dangerous to empire. If the world sees an African woman commanding fleets, negotiating with superpowers, speaking multiple languages, educating herself in philosophy, medicine, astronomy, then the whole Africa was behind story crumbles like old plaster. So they didn't just rebrand Cleopatra, they rebranded the whole Nile. They carved Kemet out of Africa and stapled it to the Mediterranean world. They built a fake neighborhood called the Cradle of Western Civilization and quietly evicted Africa from its own house. That's why in their movies the sand is African, but the faces are not. The pyramids are African, but the accents are British. The Nile is African, but the story is Western. They want the backdrop, not the bloodline. They want the gold mask, not the black hands that shaped it. They want Cleopatra's legend, not Cleopatra's lineage. So they say she was Greek, so it's complicated. No, it's not complicated. It's layered, but it's not complicated. She was queen of Africa on African land, ruling an African kingdom in an African civilization, overwhelmingly African in people, culture, and memory. You can argue over percentages of DNA if you want. Empire loves when we drown in details and forget the direction. The direction is this. They needed to drag Cleopatra north to drag Africa down. They needed to call her European to keep Europe on the throne of civilization. They buried her Africanness to bury Africa's receipts. Because once you admit that this woman, this mind, this monarch, this storm stood in Africa's house, you have to admit Africa built a house worth fighting Rome for. And that, family, is the part they've been running from for centuries. Now that we see the rebrand, next we peel it back, strip away Europe's costume, walk her back across the sea, past the marble statues and Latin scripts, back to the brown river and black earth that first called her queen. Part 12. Because here's the part they don't like to say out loud. This wasn't about history. This was about ownership. Europe needed Cleopatra like a thief needs clean gloves. They couldn't stand that the last great queen of the Nile's long dynasty was sitting too close to African glory, African genius, African power, so they reached for the oldest trick in the colonial handbook. If you can't erase the empire, rebrand the ruler. They said, no, she wasn't really theirs, she was ours. Look at her name, look at her bloodline, look at our books, our scholars, our statues. She was Greek, she was European, she belongs on our side of the sea. That's how they play it. See, Europe moves like this. If something is ugly, they pin it on Africa. If something is beautiful, they drag it back to Europe. Gold mask. African savages couldn't make that. Must be foreign influence. Stone ruins. Clearly white hands once lived here. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy. Borrowed from us, just misremembered. But when it comes to Cleopatra, they flip the script. You see, this is sophisticated. This is strategy, seduction, high politics. This has to be Greek. This has to be ours. They wanted their fingerprints on Egypt's crown jewel. They wanted to put a European face on a Nile story, so the world would look at Kemet and see Athens' shadow, because Africa, to them, was supposed to be backdrop, not main character, drums, not dialogue, extras, not leads. So they took a queen who ruled African land, spoke African tongues, prayed under African skies, breathed African dust, and tried to tuck her into a European family photo. Look at the contrast. Europe writes in marble. Africa writes in stone and sun. Europe paints her pale and tragic. Africa knows her as layered and lethal. Soft voice, hard choices, standing in a long line of women who wore crowns before Europe even knew what a bath was. Europe sells you Cleopatra as a love story, Rome, romance, perfume, and silk sheets. Africa remembers her as a power story, alliance, strategy, survival on a chessboard soaked in empire. They needed her Greek so Egypt could sound like an exception, not an African rule. So they could say, see, when this place was great, it wasn't really African. That's the lie, because if Cleopatra is African, then the last bright flame of ancient Egypt is part of our fire. Then you have to admit that black soil birthed libraries, black hands lifted obelisks, black minds mapped the stars, and black women sat on thrones that made Caesar look like a visitor. Can't have that, right? So they sharpened their pens like little colonial knives, cut her loose from her roots, and tried to float her across the Mediterranean into their mythology. But understand this, bloodline is not the whole story. A passport don't define a soul. A family tree don't cancel a homeland. Cleopatra was raised on African wind, African water, African politics, African gods watching from the dark. She didn't rule a Greek island. She ruled the mouth of the Nile, the throat of Africa, where caravan and ocean shook hands every sunrise. Europe wants you to think civilization flows north, like the Nile runs backward into whiteness. But the river don't lie. It starts in black earth, moves through black kingdoms, feeds black cities, then kisses the Mediterranean like, here, take what we've grown, but don't you dare pretend you planted it. So when they rebrand Cleopatra as Greek, what they're really saying is, we can't let Africa own its own legends. They want our story without our face, our brilliance without our blackness. That's why we peel it back, not to deny the mix, but to deny the theft. Not to rewrite, but to reroute. Because once you see the game, you stop asking, was she Greek or African? And start asking, who profits when Africa is pushed out of its own frame? And the answer echoes from Cairo to Cape Town. The same people who painted God pale, Christ blonde, and history with Europe at the center of a world it did not build. Next, we walk into the receipts, the language, the land, the legacy, all the things they couldn't fully bury, no matter how hard they tried to rename our queen. Part 13. First, let's talk a Caribbean language. They love to say, Cleopatra spoke Greek, so she must be Greek, as if tongue alone decides your blood, as if a colonizer's language never sat on a black mouth like a forced mask. By that logic, half of Africa is now English, French, Portuguese, Arabic. Does that make us European? Does that make us Arab? No, it makes us conquered, then clever enough to flip their tools for our own survival. Cleopatra spoke Greek, Egyptian, maybe more, because power demands translation. Empire speaks in many tongues, but roots speak in land, in lineage, in who claims you and who you claim back. And that takes us to the land. Tourism Ost. Europe loves to drag her out of the Nile and set her on a marble pedestal in some imaginary Athens. But Cleopatra's story ain't born in no snow. Her crown is carved from Nile silt, papyrus, and desert suns that don't apologize. Her throne was not some European balcony overlooking cobblestone streets. It was Africa. Temples aligned with stars, pyramids older than their entire timeline, cities that glowed with science, while Europe still feared the dark. They want you to forget that Kemet, that black soil by the Nile, fed the world mathematics, medicine, architecture, before Europe even knew what a bath was. But they'll tell you Cleopatra was Greek, like she just wandered in from some whitewashed postcard of the Mediterranean. Nah, she ruled Egypt, fought for Egypt, bled for Egypt. A land on African coordinates, on African sand, with African gods watching. You don't get to stand on African ground, wear African crowns, command African armies, and then be rebranded as Europe's daughter just because Europe wishes it were true. Then comes The legacy. Look at who loved her, who followed her, who buried her name in songs, myths, and memory. It wasn't Europe building shrines to this Greek queen. Rome feared her. Europe twisted her, made her a seductress, a temptress, a problem. But Africa? Africa remembered her as a ruler, a strategist, a woman who stood eye to eye with empires and didn't flinch. Ask yourself if she was so Greek. Why did Europe need to rewrite her so badly? Because the image of a powerful African woman sitting on a golden throne, outsmarting Roman generals holding the keys to grain, gold, and geography, that image burns holes through their fragile myths. So they renamed her, reskinned her, dragged her across the map from Africa to Europe with the stroke of a pen and the lie of a textbook. But the receipts don't lie. The language she used was empire's mask. The land she ruled was African ground. The legacy she left terrified Europe so much they had to repaint her face to sleep at night. They buried the truth under marble statues and Hollywood lighting, but the Nile still whispers her real story, and that's the part they couldn't erase, so they tried to rename it. Part 14. Europe said she was one of ours. Africa laughed, a long, ancient laugh that sounds like drums at midnight and pyramids at sunrise. See, Europe writes history like a thief writes receipts. Only what they stole gets documented. They needed Cleopatra to be Greek because they couldn't handle an African woman running empires like side hustles. They needed her to sound like marble halls and white columns, not mud brick cities and black incense smoke curling up to the gods. So they took her name off the Nile, stamped it with their own accent, and called it civilization. But listen, Africa was building libraries while Europe was still trying to bathe once a year. Africa was charting stars while Europe was arguing about whether the earth was cursed or round. Africa was raising queens who spoke 9 languages, commanded fleets, and negotiated with Rome like equals, while Europe was raising men who thought women were property with pulses. So, when Cleopatra stood at the crossroads of continents, wrapped in linen and legacy, they saw something they couldn't afford to admit. This wasn't just a Greek queen. This was Africa wearing a crown that touched 3 worlds, and that truth burned their eyes. So they dimmed the lights, changed the casting, swapped the melanin for marble, the Nile for the Aegean, the coal-lined gaze for blue-eyed fantasy. They turned a daughter of the Nile into a European daydream, hoping if they said it enough we'd forget where the river flows. But rivers remember, and every time the Nile kisses the sand, it writes her name back in the soil, whispering she was ours before she was theirs, and no repainting can change the blood in a woman's veins. Part 15. Europe loves a costume. They show up late to the party, kick in the door, then act like they built the house. See, when Europe met Kemet, it was like a man walking into a cathedral of light with muddy shoes on. Africa had libraries while Europe was still trying to remember how to bathe. Africa had calendars while they were arguing with the dark. Africa mapped the stars while they were scared of the night. So, what do you do when the people you call primitive are holding the blueprints to your whole civilization? You don't admit it. You remix it. You bleach it. Cleopatra wasn't just a woman. She was a symbol, a throne with hips, a crown with a heartbeat, a black mirror that showed the world where the power really flowed from. And that, right there, made Europe nervous. Because if the last pharaoh of Kemet looked like the soil of the Nile, if her face matched the faces they chained in ships centuries later, then the whole lie cracks. So they grabbed her story like they grab everything else. Gold, land, people, gods. And they dragged it. North, they said, nah, she's not African, she's Greek. Just like that, no receipts, no shame. They hid behind the word Ptolemaic like a mask, hoping you wouldn't ask who taught who fed who crowned who. They don't tell you those Greek kings came to sit on African thrones, not the other way around. They don't tell you that the language of power was still carved in hieroglyphs, that the temples still faced the sun, that the priests still spoke the tongue of the Nile. Europe came with names. Africa already had meaning. But in the movie, in the textbook, in the museum brochure, they frame her like this: pale skin, soft features, accent from the north, story from the south, soul erased in the edit. They rebranded her like a stolen product. Same original source, new label on the bottle. Because if Cleopatra is Greek, then Egypt is Mediterranean. If Egypt is Mediterranean, then it's not really Africa. If it's not really Africa, then the pyramids ain't really black genius. See the trick? They didn't just repaint her face, they tried to move the whole country off the map of our memory. But the land remembers, the sun don't lie, the melanin in the soil don't lie. The statues with broken noses still whisper through the damage, saying, "They had to break our faces to break your reflection." Europe sells you Cleopatra as a myth in marble, soft and distant, a whisper from the Aegean. Africa knows Cleopatra as a storm in silk, feet in the Nile, mind like a war drum, moving through palaces that were old before Europe learned to write its name. So when they say, "She was Greek," hear what they're really saying. We can't let Africa own this level of glory. We can't let black children see themselves on that kind of throne. We can't let the origin story look like them. But truth is stubborn. Truth is that drum you hear at night, even when the colonizer plugs his ears. And every time the Nile rises, every time a black child opens a forbidden book, every time an elder says, "Nah, that's not how it went," Cleopatra steps out of their whitewashed frame, wipes the dust off her skin, and stands where she's always stood, on African ground, under African sun, answering to no one but the ancestors and the river that raised her. Europe can borrow the story, but Africa is the author. Part 16. Because the moment Europe realized that Nile Queen wasn't some pale marble statue but a brown-skinned daughter of the continent, they panicked. See, Africa had a woman who spoke to generals like students, to scholars like equals, to emperors like men, not gods. A woman who sat on a throne older than their languages, older than their maps, older than their idea of civilization itself. And Europe looked at that power, that poise, that African woman commanding Rome's attention and said, no, she can't be theirs. Like, she must be ours. Rename her, repaint her, rebrand her. So they reached for the word Greek like a bottle of bleach, tried to scrub the Nile off her skin, wash the continent out her blood, turn Kemet into a side note in someone else's chapter. See the trick? If Cleopatra is Greek, then Egypt is a European side project. If Egypt is a European side project, then pyramids, science, medicine, star maps, and stone temples become Western heritage. And if all that genius is Western heritage, then Africa is left with nothing but chains in the story. That's the hustle. They took one dynasty with Macedonian roots, called it the only truth, then used it like a crowbar to pry Egypt away from Africa. Never mind that the soil is African, the Nile is African, the gods are African, the language, the rhythm, the worldview, African to the bone. Never mind that Cleopatra was the last light of a long, black sunrise, not the first spark of some European flame. Europe sells the highlight reel. Africa holds the full Always documentary. Europe says she was Greek like us, sophisticated like us, educated like us. Africa answers she was sovereign like us, strategic like us, storm and sunshine in one body, like every African mother who ever stared down an empire just to feed her children. Understand this. Greek became a costume they draped over her memory, a mask to make her safe for European textbooks. Easier to digest, easier to claim, easier to parade in museums without hearing the Nile whisper thief in every echo. Because if children in Lagos, Cairo, Nairobi, Kingston, Bahia, Atlanta all grow up knowing Cleopatra was African-rooted royalty, not Europe's adopted daughter, then the spell breaks. The lie trembles. The map redraws itself. The narrative shifts from Africa was taught to Africa taught the world. So they rebranded her, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of an Africa that remembers. Fear of a people who connect the dots. Fear of a continent that looks at the Nile and says, this is ours, she was ours, the story is ours. Europe can keep the costume. Africa keeps the bloodline. Europe can argue over her accent. Africa remembers her silence, how she stood before Rome and did not flinch. They renamed her for comfort. We reclaim her for truth. Part 17. Europe loves costume parties. They dress history up in borrowed faces and rented names. See, when Africa birthed the legend, the world starts shaking. So Europe reaches for its paintbrush, its marble, its Latin, its civilized tongue, and says, no, no, she was one of ours. They saw a queen on the Nile and panicked. A woman with a spine like a spear, eyes like verdicts, and a mind that could play chess on 3 empires at once. Africa called her daughter. Europe called her Hellenistic. You hear the trick? Africa gave her blood. Europe gave her branding. They couldn't stand the idea that a woman from the warm side of the sun could stare down Caesar, dance with power, and not blink. So they dragged her story north, dipped it in white marble, and stamped it. Greek enough. Posters, paintings, Hollywood frames, softened her nose, thinned her lips, lightened her skin, clipped her roots. They turned a Nile storm into a Mediterranean breeze. Because if Cleopatra stays African, Rome looks smaller, Europe looks younger, the story looks different. If she's African, then Caesar wasn't taming a province. He was negotiating with the South. If she's African, then Rome didn't discover greatness. It tried to swallow it and choked, so they called her Greek the way they call stolen art acquired, the way they call invasion expansion, the way they call erasure reinterpretation. Understand this, Africa doesn't need permission to claim its children. The Nile doesn't ask the rain for documentation. Europe deals in paperwork. Africa deals in memory. Europe says, show me your bloodline. Africa says, I know your spirit. They say, her dynasty spoke Greek. We say, her kingdom drank the Nile. They say she was of Macedonian descent. We say she ruled African land, wore African sun, moved African armies, held African gods in her breath. You can't stand in Kemet, breathe that black soil, walk past pyramids older than your oldest cathedral, and tell us this is Europe's story. No, Europe is the guest who walked into Africa's house, sat on Africa's furniture, ate Africa's food, and then told the world they built the place. Cleopatra was rebranded the way they rebrand everything that makes them feel small. Put a Greek label on an African bottle and hope the world never reads the fine print. But Africa? Africa is the fine print, the part they hope you skip. The line at the bottom that says, property of the motherland on loan to no one. They renamed her for comfort. We remember her for impact. Europe wants a Cleopatra who sips wine in marble halls. Africa remembers a Cleopatra who stared down empires with coal-lined eyes and a kingdom at her back. They gave her a myth that fits their mirrors. We give her a truth that fits her crown. And this is where the story turns, where the Nile stops whispering and starts roaring. Part 18. Europe writes in pencil. Africa remembers in stone. See, Europe loves a makeover. They'll bleach the past like it's laundry day. Take a brown-skinned queen, rinse her in marble, hang her in a museum with a nose that never met the sun. They needed Cleopatra to be theirs, not Egypt's, not Africa's, not a daughter of the Nile with coal on her eyes and a kingdom in her spine. So they did what they always do. They dragged her across the map from the banks of the Nile to the halls of Olympus. They gave her a new passport, stamped her Greek, filed her under European classic instead of African's power. Because if Cleopatra is African, then Africa isn't just drums and deserts in their documentaries. Africa is strategy. Africa is astronomy. Africa is libraries on fire and languages in gold. Africa is a woman who made Rome sweat, but Europe can't swallow that. So they split her in two. Her blood, Greek. Her throne, coincidence. Her beauty, ours. Her genius, inherited from us. They'll tell you her dynasty was Macedonian. Like that erases the dust under her feet. Like that changes the sun she prayed under. Like bloodline alone can exile a soul from its soil. Listen close. Empire doesn't just erase people. It erases geography. It moves borders in your mind. It makes you forget that Egypt is Africa, that the Nile cuts through black memory like a spine through a body. They'll show you maps where the Mediterranean is a European lake, and Africa is just below, under, less than, background. But the Nile flowed south to north long before those maps. It carried black science, black gods, black crowns up and down its back while Europe was still learning to bathe. So when they met Cleopatra, they met a problem. How do you explain a woman from Africa who spoke like a scholar, ruled like a storm, and played world powers like a game of Senet? You don't. You repaint her. You put her in white stone, straight nose, soft curls, light skin that never fought that Egyptian sun. You cast her in Hollywood with faces that never knew what it means to be followed in a store or written out of a book. You turn her into a European fantasy instead of an African fact. Because if our children know that Cleopatra was rooted in Africa, they might start asking, what else did we build? Who else did we crown? What else did they steal, rename, and resell to us as Western civilization? Europe markets memory like a luxury brand. Africa carries memory like an heirloom. They got paintings, sculptures, costumes, theater. We got grandmothers who point at the Nile and say, that's ours. They got scholars who debate her shade. We got a continent that knows sun when it sees it. So understand this, calling Cleopatra Greek wasn't about accuracy. It was about custody. It was about custody of genius, custody of beauty, custody of power. If they can call her Greek, they can call our brilliance a loan from them. They can say, you were great because we touched you. But the Nile don't flow because Greece believed in it. The pyramids don't stand because Europe approved them. Cleopatra rose from a land where gods wore brown faces, where the calendar listened to the stars, where medicine was older than their myths. They rebranded her to make Africa look like a student instead of a teacher. They needed her on their side of the color line, on their side of the sea, in their story, not ours. But eras change, mirrors crack, and the Nile remembers its own. Next time you see her in a movie, in a painting, on a page, ask yourself, who benefits from her being Greek? Who trembles when you say she was African? That tremble is the truth. Follow it. Part 18. Europe wrote her in marble. Africa remembers her in melanin. They said she was Greek, pure Greek, a dainty daughter of Olympus lost in the wrong latitude. We say she was a daughter of the Nile, crowned in a library of languages, moving like a storm through empires, standing on African soil with African sun on her skin. See, Europe don't just rewrite history, they wrote it. They drag our stories out of our mother's house, dress them in white togas, and then swear that's how they were born. They point at Ptolemy's like a passport. Look, her bloodline is Macedonian, but bloodline is not the whole story. Landline matters too, where the ancestors are buried, where the gods answer, where the river knows your name. Cleopatra wasn't raised on Greek cobblestone. She was raised on African dust and incense, papyrus and pyramids, temples older than their entire mythology. But Europe got a habit. Anything powerful, ancient, beautiful, they pull it toward themselves like a thief dragging stolen gold into a dim back room. They couldn't stand that an African throne held one of the sharpest minds in history. They couldn't stand that Rome bent its politics around a woman from the Nile. So they did what they always do. They blurred her edges, they lightened her image, they cut her from the continent and pasted her on their own reflection, posters, paintings, Hollywood frames. Cleopatra slowly turned from a queen of the south to a mascot of the north, hair straightened, nose narrowed, skin washed in the moonlight until the sun no longer recognized her. They said, "She's ours. Look at the lineage." But lineage without location is a lion costume. Alexander stepped into Kemet, but Kemet didn't become Greek. The Nile flowed before their alphabet, and it still flows after their empires turned to dust. Africa is the stage. They were just visiting actors. They'll tell you, Egypt is not really Africa. It's Mediterranean. Translation: we need distance between blackness and brilliance. This old. Because if Egypt stands as Africa, then the narrative cracks. The myth that says blackness is new to power, late to civilization, absent from genius. So they split the map like a trick deck. North Africa, not that black. Cleopatra, not that African. Egypt, not that continent. Every not that is just them saying, we refuse to see Africa as the mother of what we worship. But the stones remember, the hieroglyphs remember, the Nubian neighbors remember. The desert doesn't forget footsteps even when the ink lies. Cleopatra was rebranded Greek for the same reason they call stolen art collections, colonies protectorates, and invasions discoveries. Language is their weapon. Labels are their camouflage. They needed her to be Greek so Europe could feel closer to a power it never birthed. They needed her to be Greek so Africa could be pushed one step further from its own reflection. But we're not buying the costume. We see the seams. We hear the Nile laughing at every whitewashed portrait. They gave her a borrowed ancestry to erase a continent from her crown. We bring her back home to the soil that shaped her shadow. Because in their version, she's a myth in marble. In ours, she's a woman of earth and empire, standing at the crossroads of black memory and stolen credit. And this is where the contrast cuts deep. Europe needs to own greatness. Africa just needs to remember it. Part 19. Because if Cleopatra is African, Europe's favorite mirror starts to crack. See, Europe been selling you a movie for 500 years. Soft lighting, marble columns, every hero pale as winter. They needed Egypt, but not the Africans in it. So they did what empire always does. They rebranded. They took a Nile queen, born on African soil, breathing African air, moving through African power, and tried to stamp property of Greece on her forehead, not because they loved history, because they loved control. Understand this, Europe doesn't just conquer land, it conquers imagination. It redraws maps inside your mind. Africa gave the world its first kingdoms, its first sciences, its first calendars, its first gods. Europe met that and felt small, not in front of us, in front of the truth. So what do you do when the people you called primitive built pyramids so precise NASA still nods in respect? You blur the face on the throne. You say, Egypt? Oh, that was basically Europe. Those weren't black people, just kind of tan Greeks. You hear the trick? If Egypt becomes Mediterranean, Africa loses her crown. If Cleopatra becomes Greek, Africa loses a daughter. If Kemet becomes Middle East, Africa loses a chapter. They keep the gold, the story, the glory, and leave you with charity commercials and dusty stereotypes. Europe versus Africa. Europe writes sequels to other people's stories and calls it civilization. Africa ashes the original script. Europe builds museums full of stolen sunlight, then lectures the world about culture. Africa's culture is so deep they had to invade it, rename it, and still couldn't copy the flavor. They'll tell you Cleopatra was Greek from a Macedonian line. Cool. And where did that line rule? Africa. What soil fed their throne? Africa. What gods watched their rise and fall? Africa. You can't move into my house and then claim my address ain't mine. They never tremble when you say Aristotle was Greek. They never stutter when you say Caesar was Roman, but say Cleopatra was African and watch the room shift. Watch the voices get high-pitched. Watch actually start tap dancing. That tremble ain't about one woman. It's about the door she unlocks. Because if Cleopatra is African, then Egypt is African. If Egypt is African, then science, math, medicine, architecture, astronomy, spiritual systems they brag about got African roots. And if all that is African, then the whole lie of Africa as backward falls apart like cheap plaster. So they fight for Cleopatra like she's a border, because she is. On one side, Europe's fantasy, a world where whiteness invented everything, discovered everything, ruled everything. On the other side, Africa's memory, a world where black genius didn't ask permission, didn't wait for validation, didn't bow to nobody's inferiority complex. They don't just argue over her nose, her skin tone, her features. They arguing over ownership of time itself. Who gets to say what civilization looks like? Who gets to point at a map and say, this is where greatness lives? They know if your children see Cleopatra as African, standing tall on black soil, speaking many tongues, commanding fleets, moving armies, negotiating with empires, then your children might start asking, what else did they lie about? And that question is dangerous, because once you follow that thread, you find Timbuktu's libraries, Nubia's queens, Carthage's fleets, Great Zimbabwe's stones, Benin's bronzes, Mero's iron, Kush's warriors. You find out Africa was not waiting for Europe to arrive. Africa was busy. So they bury the queen under Greek letters, Latin scripts, Hollywood filters. They drown her in scholarly debates, while the real issue is simple. Why does the idea of an African woman holding that much power shake the room? Why does her being ours threaten theirs? Because if Cleopatra is African, then Africa is not the world's shadow. Africa is the lighthouse, and everything they took, everything they renamed, everything they dressed up in marble and Latin starts to look like borrowed clothes. They're not afraid of Cleopatra's face. They're afraid of Africa's reflection in her eyes. Part 19. Europe moves like this. If they didn't build it, they brand it. If they didn't birth it, they bleach it. If they didn't dream it, they drag it into their museum and slap their flag on the label. Africa moves like this. We don't need to steal your heroes. We're still trying to remember the ones you buried. We don't need to repaint your legends. We're still dusting off the ones you tried to erase. Cleopatra was never just a woman. She was a mirror, and Europe hates a mirror it can't control. So what did they do? They took an African queen standing on African soil, ruling African land, speaking to African people, and filed her under Greek enough to claim, African enough to exoticize, but never black enough to inspire the children of the sun. Understand the game. Europe doesn't argue over skin. It argues over credit. If the story makes them look small, they rewrite it tall. If the glory stands on black foundations, they build a white balcony on top and give tours from there. They saw Cleopatra at the crossroads of continents, breathing African air, moving through African power, standing in a lineage of Nile-born divinity. And they panicked, because if Cleopatra is remembered as African, as a daughter of the soil, as a woman whose world was carved by black civilizations, long before Europe learned to bathe regularly, then the whole house of lies starts to crack. So they reached for the oldest trick in the colonizer's handbook. Rebrand the evidence. Europe said, she's royal, must be Greek. She's strategic, must be Greek. She's educated, must be Greek. She spoke Greek. Ah, there it is, our golden ticket. As if language alone decides your blood. As if speaking French made Africans French. As if praying in English made us European. As if a colonizer's tongue can erase a continent from your face. Africa knows better. We've seen this movie before. They called Egypt Middle East to pull it from the mother's lap. They called Kemet mysterious, so you wouldn't call it black. They called African philosophy myth and Greek philosophy thought. Same wisdom, different skin. One gets a statue, the other gets silence. Europe needs Cleopatra to be Greek because Europe needs a straight line from Athens to empire, from marble statues to modern power. No interruptions, no black fingerprints, no African fingerprints on the crown. Africa doesn't need Cleopatra to be anything but the truth. She can be mixed. She can be complex. She can be a blend of bloodlines like most of the world. But she was shaped by African sun, African soil, African struggle. That's the part they keep trying to crop out the frame. Europe says, if she's great, she's ours. Africa says, if she's real, she's welcome. Europe builds myths to cover insecurity. Africa digs up memory to heal amnesia. So when they rebranded Cleopatra as Greek, it wasn't history, it was marketing. A PR campaign for a fragile ego. A way of saying nothing truly grand could have grown from the Nile unless we watered it. But we remember. We remember pyramids staring down the stars before Europe knew the stars were anything but holes in the sky. We remember libraries burned to ash, scholars scattered, scrolls stolen, names twisted in foreign tongues. We remember a time when the world came Turit, Africa, to learn. And Cleopatra was one of the last bright flames before the curtain of conquest fell over the stage. So understand, this isn't just about one queen. This is about a pattern. When Europe can't erase you, it will rename you. When it can't deny your genius, it will relocate it. Move your glory from black to other, from Africa to Mediterranean, from home to heritage site. But we are done letting our greatness be outsourced. Cleopatra doesn't need their passport stamp. She doesn't need their approval rating. She stands where she always stood, on African ground and African history, in a story that was global long before Europe learned to spell civilization. And that's why the rebrand will never sit right, because no matter how many times they repaint her face, the Nile still whispers her name in an African tongue. Part 20. Because once you admit Cleopatra was African royalty, you gotta admit the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a bloodstream, feeding empires, feeding languages, feeding gods. Once you admit Cleopatra was African, you gotta admit the cradle of civilization ain't some museum slogan. It's a birth certificate, signed in brown skin, sealed in gold dust, witnessed by the sun. So what do you do when the people you erased start remembering themselves? You rebrand, you repaint, you remix the story. You take an African queen and call her Hellenistic. You take a black dynasty and call it a cultural blend. You wrap the Nile in a toga and pray nobody asks what's under the costume. You flood the world with marble statues and pale portraits, then whisper, "See, she looks like us." But marble lies, stone lies, paintings lie, power lies. You can't trust a portrait commissioned by the thief, because Cleopatra wasn't a statue. She was a storm. She was politics and prophecy, perfume and strategy, seduction and statecraft, all in one heartbeat. But when Africa wears power, the world gets nervous. So they put her in a Greek dress, hand her a Greek script, call her a Western icon, then hide the map that points back to Kemet, back to Kush, back to the soil they keep trying not to say out loud. Africa, they'll tell you she was Macedonian by blood. But ask them, whose land raised her? Whose gods guarded her? Whose river carved her reflection into the morning? She didn't rise from the stones of Athens. She rose from the Nile's mist, from papyrus and incense, from temples older than their entire mythology. You don't get to stand on African ground for centuries, speak African tongues, worship African deities, rule African people, then turn around and say, this wasn't really Africa. That's not history. That's laundering. They scrubbed her with Latin, rinsed her in Greek, hung her up to dry in European galleries, then told the world, look what we made. But Cleopatra is not their invention. She is their inheritance. And they've been fronting like they built the house they were just renting. Because if Cleopatra is African, Then Rome looks less like a father and more like a son. Greece looks less like the source and more like a student. Europe stops being the center and starts being a chapter. And that's the fear, not her eyeliner, not her lovers, not her legend. The fear is this: if Africa had queens like that, then Africa had thinkers like that. If Africa had courts like that, then Africa had systems like that. If Africa had Cleopatra, then Africa had more. More brilliance, more power, more science, more philosophy, more everything they told you only bloomed in the white marble of the West. They didn't rebrand Cleopatra to protect her. They rebranded Cleopatra to protect the lie that civilization flowed northward, the lie that genius has a lighter shade, the lie that the story starts in Athens and not in the shadows of the pyramids. So they took her crown and called it Greek influence, took her language and called it Western tradition, took her story and filed it under European heritage. But listen close. When the wind moves over the Nile, it doesn't whisper in Greek. It hums in something older, deeper, darker, rooted. You can bury bones, but you can't bury roots. You can erase a face from the fresco, but you can't erase the soil that fed it. And that's why they fight so hard over this woman's passport. They know what happens if Africa reclaims her, because Cleopatra is not just a queen, she's a mirror. And when Africa looks in that mirror, Africa doesn't see a footnote. Africa sees a main character. Picture a black girl in Lagos, in Kingston, in Detroit, scrolling through history and seeing Cleopatra who looks like her auntie, like her mama, like herself. Picture a boy in Accra, in Nairobi, in London, learning that the first libraries hearsed into ash weren't in Europe, but on African ground, learning that the first astronomers mapping the heavens weren't under a Roman sky, but under African stars. That's what's at stake. Imagination, possibility, birthright. If Cleopatra is African, then Africa didn't just contribute to human civilization. Africa authored chapters they tried to publish under another name, so they rebranded her to break the trail, to make the children think they showed up late to a party they actually started. But the trail is still there, in the hieroglyphs, in the temples, in the nose. They chipped off the statues because it curved like too many faces they wanted erased. The trail is there in the way they argue, foam at the mouth, write think pieces and angry essays anytime someone says Cleopatra was African. If it wasn't true, they wouldn't sweat this hard. Ask yourself, why fight so violently over one woman's continent if it doesn't shake the throne of the whole story? Because once Cleopatra is African, Europe has to climb down from the pedestal and stand in line with everyone else, not the chosen child, just another descendant. Once Cleopatra is African, Africa stops being the dark continent and starts being the dimmed light they kept turning down so their own would look brighter. So here we are, centuries later, arguing over her face like it's just about skin, when it's really about origin, about who gets to say, we were there at the beginning. Here's the truth. They can debate the shade, the curl pattern, the exact coordinates of her family tree, but they cannot move the land she ruled from. They cannot repaint the sun that bronzed her. They cannot un-African the ground beneath her palace. Cleopatra's throne stood on African earth. Her power moved through African veins. Her story rose from African waters. You can rebrand the queen, but you can't rebrand the river. So when you hear them say, she was Greek, she was European, she was ours, understand the hustle. They're not just claiming a woman, they're claiming a legacy. They're claiming a lineage they didn't birth. But history has a way of circling back, of peeling off labels, of returning stolen names to their rightful tongues. And everything they took, everything they renamed, everything they dressed up in marble and Latin starts to look like borrowed clothes, because under the costume, under the whitewash, under the centuries of spin, Cleopatra is still what she was, An African queen standing at the crossroads of continents, speaking to empires in a voice dipped in Nile water. And they're not afraid of Cleopatra's face. They're afraid of what her face unlocks. They're afraid of Africa standing up in the mirror and recognizing itself. They're not afraid of Cleopatra's face. They're afraid of Africa's reflection in her eyes.